She couldn't explain it. Not to herself. Not to anyone else. It wasn't something you could describe over coffee or drop into casual conversation. Not the dreams. Not the ache. Not the feeling that she had lived 1,000 lifetimes and was now waking up from all of them at once. It started as a whisper, barely noticeable, a strange sensation behind her ribs, a pressure, soft but persistent, like a forgotten name trying to return to the tongue. Then came the dreams. They weren't nightmares. They were beautiful, terrifying, electric. She would wake gasping, heart pounding, tears streaming down her face for reasons she couldn't name. Each night, the same strange rhythm, a golden light in the distance, ancient stairways cut into cliffs, a low hum that vibrated in her bones. And always, the feeling that someone was waiting for her. Or maybe it was something, a place, a memory, a version of herself she had buried beneath the noise of modern life. Her name was Eliara, and for as long as she could remember, she'd sensed that the world she was taught to believe in, the polished, logical, linear world, was only the surface. That somewhere beneath it, something vast and ancient pulsed like a hidden river. The truth didn't come in a thunderclap. It arrived in silence, one morning after another dream where she stood at the edge of a high cliff, facing an ancient city shrouded in mist. The name echoed in her mind as she opened her eyes. Inti. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew where to go. 3 days later, Eliara stood on a mountain ridge in Peru, breathless from altitude, surrounded by the sunlit ruins of Machu Picchu. The landscape unfolded around her like a painting from another life. Lush, wild green stretching into the sky, stone walls softened by moss and time, mountains rising like ancient guardians holding secrets too vast for words. And in that moment, she wasn't thinking about enlightenment. She wasn't chasing healing. She was just remembering. Something in her chest cracked open. Not pain, recognition. She had been here before. Maybe not in this body. Maybe not even in this world. But somewhere, deep in her soul, these stones, this air, this light, it had all lived inside her once. She sat alone in one of the quieter terraces, closed her eyes, and placed her hand on the earth. A low hum rose from the stone beneath her palm. It wasn't imagined. It was real, a frequency she could feel in her spine. That's when the guide appeared. She was local, older, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries. She introduced herself simply as Mariela. No flourish, no title, just presence. "You hear it, don't you?" Mariela asked, as if continuing a conversation that had started long before they met. Eliara hesitated. "I think so, but I don't understand it." "You don't have to understand. You only have to remember." That night, Eliara sat by her window beneath the stars, the sky impossibly vast. She picked up her journal, expecting to write about her day, but the words that poured out weren't hers. They came fast, unfiltered, as if her hand was only a scribe for something deeper. "You were not born to chase the light. You are the light, hidden under layers of forgetting. You came here not to learn, but to remember. The temple is not lost. It sleeps within you." She stared at the page, trembling. Her logical mind wanted to question it, rationalize it, discredit it. But her body knew, her heart knew, and her dreams had already begun to speak a language older than thought. The next morning, she wandered deeper into the ruins, beyond the crowds, beyond the camera flashes, beyond the explanations. She stood beneath the Temple of the Sun, the air thick with presence, and understood something without needing to name it. This wasn't a monument. It was a machine. Not of metal, but of memory. Everything around her, the stones, the layout, the angles aligned with the solstice sun, they weren't aesthetic choices. They were coded messages. Messages not meant for the eyes, but for the soul. She felt it in the marrow of her being. What if these places weren't built to honor the dead, but to awaken the living? What if the myths were blueprints? What if the temples were mirrors? Later that day, she met another traveler. His name was Kalen, a quiet Irish seeker who had come on a similar intuitive pull. They exchanged stories, not just of flights and bookings, but of dreams, of symbols, of synchronicities that couldn't be explained. "I've been chasing something I don't understand," he said, "but being here, it's like the chasing stops, like I already know, I just forgot." Eliara nodded. Same. They didn't need to say more. The real conversation was happening beneath the words, in glances, in silence, in the gravity that bound two souls awakening to the same pulse. That evening, just before dusk, Eliara climbed to the highest ridge above Machu Picchu. Alone. The sky stretched endlessly, the mountains glowing gold. She sat, legs crossed, hands open, and whispered a question. Not to the gods, not to the stars, but to the part of herself that had been sleeping. Why am I here? And in the stillness that followed, a single truth landed softly in her heart. You're not here to find the sacred. You're here to remember you never lost it. She didn't need to be told what would come next. She knew this was only the beginning. A door had opened. Not in the world, but within her. She wasn't chasing enlightenment. She was returning to herself. If you felt something stir while listening, if you've ever wondered if there's more to this life than what you've been shown, if you've carried questions with no name and dreams with no origin, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep sharing these stories, these awakenings, and this journey of remembering together. Your support helps us create more of the deep, soul-stirring content that so many are ready to hear. Because the temples were never meant to be admired from afar. They were meant to be become. And maybe you didn't find this by accident. Maybe you've walked this path before. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to walk it again. The air in Cambodia was different, thick, alive, pulsing with something ancient. Eliara stepped off the dusty path and into the shade of towering fig trees, their roots coiled around crumbling stone like sleeping serpents. She had arrived at Angkor Wat, not as a tourist, not as a historian, but as a listener. Something here had been calling to her, not loudly, not clearly, but steadily, like a heartbeat beneath the surface of her life. It had started again. Those same dreams, towering structures, narrow corridors, carvings lit by firelight. Except this time they were different, less fragmented, more familiar. She'd wake up with her hand outstretched, as if reaching for something she couldn't quite grasp, and then came the visions in waking life, spirals in clouds, symbols on strangers' jewelry, an unmistakable magnetic pull toward a place she'd never been. Now that she was here, the feeling intensified. Angkor wasn't just beautiful, it was alive. It breathed with memory. Not her memory, exactly, but a memory she belonged to. She walked slowly through the massive entryway, past columns weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The walls whispered, not with sound, but with presence, with a weight that couldn't be measured, only felt. The closer she got to the inner sanctum, the more it felt like she was walking into herself. The sun filtered through cracks in the stone ceiling, sending warm shafts of light onto the worn stone floor. Eliara paused in one of the smaller chambers, her fingers brushing a faded bas-relief etched into the wall. A familiar sensation rose in her again. That soft pressure behind her ribs, the same one she'd felt in Peru. Her breath deepened, unbidden, as if her body remembered something her mind hadn't yet caught up with. "Did you feel that?" a voice asked behind her. She turned. It was Kalen. He looked different here, more grounded, more awake. They hadn't planned to meet again. They hadn't even exchanged contact details in Peru. But there he was, notebook in hand, leaning casually against the same wall she had just touched, as if it had been arranged. "I thought I was imagining it," Eliara replied softly. "You're not," he said. "These stones remember." They walked together for hours, barely speaking. There was no need. The silence between them held more meaning than most conversations. Occasionally, one of them would stop, place a hand on the stone, and close their eyes. Not to pray, not to ask for anything, but to feel. And each time, the sensation grew stronger, a low vibration beneath their palms, like an echo of something once spoken in a language older than words. Later, in a courtyard overtaken by tree roots and moss, Kalen turned to her. "What if these temples weren't built to be looked at?" he asked. "What if they were built to be entered? Not just physically, but energetically?" Eliara nodded slowly. "Like walking into a memory that's been waiting for you to return." He smiled. "Exactly." They found a small inner chamber later that afternoon. It had no tourists, no signs, no guards, just a narrow doorway and a dome-shaped ceiling. When they stepped inside, something shifted. The air thickened. The silence deepened. "Say something," Kalen whispered. Eliara hesitated, then softly spoke the word that had been in her chest all day. "Home." The sound vibrated in the chamber, echoing not just off the walls but through their bodies. It wasn't just a sound, it was a frequency, a key turning in an invisible lock. Kalen closed his eyes and whispered, "Awake." And the room seemed to pulse. It was then that Eliara understood. These temples weren't relics. They were technologies. Not in the way modern minds understand technology, but in the way the ancients had mastered it, through vibration, resonance, geometry. These walls weren't designed to impress the eyes. They were designed to activate the soul. That night, Eliara lay beneath a mosquito net, wide awake. She wasn't restless. She was charged. Her skin tingled. Her breath moved in rhythm with something larger. She thought about the carvings, the strange symbols, the way the temple was laid out like a journey. Each threshold led inward, each courtyard a layer closer to the core. She realized that the architecture wasn't random. It mirrored a path, the path into the soul. And suddenly, something clicked. These temples weren't static places. They were maps for those ready to remember. The next day they met a monk who lived nearby. His name was Venerable Saran, and though he spoke little English, his presence carried the weight of silence. Through a translator, he explained that the monks had long used specific corridors in the temple for meditation, because the acoustics enhanced different brain states. Different chambers resonated with different intentions. He touched the center of his chest and said, "Not worship. Alignment." Eliara didn't need more explanation. Her whole body understood. Before leaving, Saran placed a small thread bracelet on her wrist. No words, just a nod, a transmission, a blessing that needed no explanation. That evening, Eliara and Kalen watched the sun set from the top of Plom Bakeng. The sky turned gold, then violet. Below them, the vast jungle spread in every direction, swallowing stone, shadow, and time. What if we're not the first ones to feel this? She asked quietly. What if people like us have always come here to remember? Kaelin stared out at the horizon. Then the temple worked. She smiled, heart full of something she hadn't had in years. Clarity. This wasn't about becoming enlightened. It was about becoming whole, about remembering that sacredness was never a destination. It was a rhythm, a resonance, a way of walking through the world, not to escape it, but to meet it, fully alive. She closed her eyes and breathed in the warm, perfumed air, letting it fill her like a hymn. Somewhere in the distance, the jungle pulsed with life, and in the space between heartbeats, she felt it again. The temple was not just stone, it was within her now, and it would rise wherever she walked. By the time Eliara stepped onto the ochre soil of Sedona, something inside her had already begun to shift. The land didn't just welcome her, it opened, as if it knew she was coming, as if it had been waiting. The red rock formation stood like sentinels, carved by wind and time, glowing under the desert sun like living altars. And within the quiet hum of the canyons, she felt the echo of something she hadn't touched in years. Not since she was a child. Not since before she was told to be smaller, quieter, more practical. She hadn't come to Sedona for answers. She had come to listen. Her guide for the next several days was a woman named Amari, a healer with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that wrapped around you like warmth from a fire. She didn't preach. She didn't posture. She simply invited Eliara to be still, to breathe, to remember that healing doesn't happen in explanation. It happens in presence. On the first evening, they sat in silence under the stars, surrounded by a circle of smooth stones and burning sage. Amari spoke softly, not to the mind, but to something deeper. "You are not broken," she said. "You're layered. And beneath all those layers, there's a temple." Eliara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her whole body did. For so long, she had searched for truth in books, in places, in people. But now she was being asked to turn inward, not to escape the world, but to finally meet herself inside it. Each morning began with breathwork, not just calm, shallow breathing, but deep, intentional movement of life force. At first, Eliara felt dizzy, uncertain, as if she were stepping into a part of herself long buried. But as the days went on, the breath began to carry her, like a river cutting through stone. One afternoon, during a breath session, a wave of emotion broke loose inside her. There was no thought, no memory, only feeling. A flood of sadness, ancient and unnamed, rose from her chest like smoke, and tears streamed down her cheeks without resistance. She didn't try to understand it. She let it move through. Amari knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on Eliara's back. "Grief," she whispered, "is sacred water. Let it cleanse you." It wasn't about healing from one specific event. It was about finally giving her body permission to speak, to release, to remember. Later that evening, as they rested on a warm sandstone ledge overlooking the valley, Amari traced a spiral into the dust beside them. "This," she said, "is your path. Not straight, not predictable, but always returning to center. And that center is not out there. It's in you." Eliara closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of sage and stone. Her hands tingled. Her heart felt both heavy and hollow, as if space was being made for something new. For the first time, she began to feel what she had only ever heard in theory, that the body itself is sacred, that its aches and pulses, its joys and trembles were not flaws, but messages. that every sensation was an invitation back to herself. She began to see the body as a temple, not metaphorically, but literally. The spine as a pillar, the heart as the inner sanctum, the breath as incense, rising and falling with reverence, her skin, her cells, her bones, each one holding memory, each one an altar of intelligence and design. She remembered how, as a little girl, she used to close her eyes and see color moving through people, swirls of light and shadow. But when she shared it, adults smiled nervously and called it imagination, so she learned to ignore it, to disbelieve it. But now, in the stillness of Sedona, with the vortex wind brushing against her skin, she felt it again, not as something outside her, but something within her. Energy, flow, presence. Amari introduced her to the language of the chakras, not as a foreign system, but as a remembering. Each center, each color, each sound, a note in the symphony of the soul. They practiced toning, vocalizing simple vowel sounds, and Eliara felt the vibrations shift something inside her, like tuning forks, clearing centuries of static. She didn't need to understand every detail. She could feel it was working. One night, after a long, silent walk through a labyrinth carved into the desert floor, Amari offered her a simple phrase: "Return to your temple." Every day. And Eliara did. She no longer viewed self-care as indulgent or spiritual work as something separate from life. She brushed her hair slowly, like a ritual. She stretched not to sculpt her body, but to awaken it. She cooked meals with intention. She walked barefoot on the earth not for grounding, but because it felt like a conversation. She began treating her daily life as sacred, not because everything was perfect, but because she was present in it. The world didn't slow down, but she did. And in that slowing, she heard things that had been there all along. Soft truths, subtle guidance, the quiet hum of her wisdom. This wasn't about transcendence. It was about embodiment. She no longer wanted to leave her body to find God. She wanted to meet the divine inside every cell of her being. By the end of the retreat, Eliara had stopped asking, "What's next?" She no longer needed a map. Her body was the compass, her breath the guide. On her last morning, she rose before the sun and climbed to a ledge overlooking the valley. The first light spilled over the rocks like honey. She sat cross-legged, spine tall, palms open, and whispered 3 words she hadn't dared say before. "I am home." She didn't mean Sedona. She meant here, in herself, in this temple of breath and bone, silence and pulse. She knew now, this path didn't begin in Peru. It didn't begin in Angkor. It didn't even begin in Sedona. It began the moment she turned inward. The moment she stopped searching for the sacred and started becoming it. And she understood, deeply and fully, that she was never just walking through temples. She was always returning to the one she carried within. The road to Mount Shasta was long, winding, and strangely quiet. Eliara sat behind the wheel of her rented car, watching pine trees stretch endlessly on either side, their dark green tips brushing the pale blue sky. She had driven for hours in silence, not out of boredom, but reverence. Every mile deeper into this landscape felt like a step away from everything she had once used to define herself. The city noise, the digital world, the constant flow of thoughts, they all fell away the closer she came to the mountain. Mount Shasta wasn't just a destination. It felt like a threshold, a place people didn't visit unless they were ready to leave behind who they had been. She had found the retreat almost by accident, or so she thought. A single-page website, no frills, no marketing, just a soft invitation. If you're ready to meet yourself beneath the noise, come. That was all it said. and somehow, that was all she needed. The cabin was simple. No electricity, no mirrors, no reception, a mattress on the floor, a candle, a journal, a single window facing the trees. When Yara, the retreat guide, handed her the key, she said only one thing before walking away. Whatever rises, stay with it. Don't try to fix, just feel. That first night was still and uneventful. Eliara sat by the window, the mountain barely visible in the moonlight. Her breath felt louder than usual. Her thoughts seemed to echo in the wooden walls. But it wasn't until the second night that the descent truly began. It came without warning, a memory. Then another. Not of specific events, but of emotions, buried, forgotten, ignored. Sadness, guilt, a deep loneliness she had learned to disguise with strength. She curled beneath the blanket, her hands trembling, not from fear of the dark outside, but from the darkness rising inside. She didn't fight it. Not this time. She knew enough now to recognize that this wasn't punishment. It was invitation. A cracking open. A beckoning from the shadows that had never truly left her, only waited for her to stop running. Time lost shape in that cabin. She didn't know how long she wept, or how many hours passed in silence. She only knew that when the morning sun finally crept through the window, something inside her had shifted. Not cleared, not healed, but acknowledged. She spent the next day in complete stillness. No writing, no meditating, just sitting, letting the thoughts and feelings pass through her like wind through trees. By the third night, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt holy. And then, the dream came. She stood before a gate, towering, ancient, carved with symbols that pulsed like heartbeat. It wasn't a dream of fear, it was a rite. She knew without being told that she had to walk through, that whatever was on the other side would not destroy her, but reveal her. Inside the gate were 7 chambers. She didn't walk through them. She was walked through them, as if her soul had waited for this pilgrimage. The first was fear. It wrapped around her like smoke, whispering every lie she had ever believed about being unworthy. Too much. Not enough. The second was anger. It burned through her skin, not at others, but at herself, for the ways she had betrayed her truth just to belong. The third was longing. A bottomless ache for something she had never been able to name, only feel. The fourth was shame, a mirror that reflected not her face, but every mask she had ever worn. The fifth was grief, heavy, vast, ancient. Not personal, but collective. The grief of every woman who had forgotten her power. The sixth was silence, absolute and infinite. Not emptiness, but presence, a field beyond thought. And the seventh was light, not a blinding external light, but an internal glow, gentle, fierce, familiar. She didn't walk out of that dream. She woke into it. The morning light poured into the cabin, golden and soft. She stood in the quiet, barefoot on the wooden floor, and placed her hands over her heart. The silence wasn't scary anymore. It was sacred. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to do anything. She just stood there, present, whole. Later that day, she walked the trails around the mountain, slow and unhurried. The air was crisp. The trees hummed. Her body felt lighter, not because the weight had disappeared, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. At the base of a rock formation, shaped like a crescent moon, she sat and wrote in her journal, "I am not here to escape the dark. I am here to illuminate it. The descent is not my undoing. It is my becoming." That evening, just as she was preparing to leave, a single message came through when her phone picked up signal. It was from Kaylin. I just finished my silence. Different place, same unraveling. Isn't it strange how the quiet reveals everything you thought you needed to avoid? She smiled, not because it was a coincidence, but because she had stopped believing in those. They were walking the same path, thousands of miles apart, parallel journeys woven by remembrance. On the drive back, the mountain faded in the rearview mirror, but Eliara didn't feel like she was leaving anything behind. She felt full, grounded. She wasn't emerging as someone new. She was emerging as someone true. She knew now that spiritual awakening wasn't always about rising. Sometimes it was about descending into silence, into discomfort, into the parts of herself she'd once feared to face. But the descent had given her something that no book, no temple, no teaching ever could. Her light, not borrowed, not inherited, born in the dark. And in that light, she found not perfection, but peace, because she no longer feared the shadows. She had walked through them and found herself waiting on the other side. Eliara never planned to go to Greece. It wasn't on her list, and she hadn't dreamed about it the way she had with Peru or Cambodia. But when the invitation came, a quiet nudge in the form of an email about a sacred symbols retreat in Delphi, it felt less like a suggestion and more like a calling. She didn't question it. She simply felt the yes in her body. The journey took her far from the noise of the cities and into the folds of the mountains, where the wind carried whispers older than language. Delphi had once been the center of the ancient world, where kings and seekers traveled to ask questions beneath the gaze of the gods. But Eliara didn't come with a question. She came to listen. The ruins of the Temple of Apollo stood like bones of a forgotten story, etched into the hillside, framed by cypress trees and sky. As she wandered slowly through the sacred grounds, something stirred in her. Not awe exactly, but recognition. The kind that doesn't speak through thought, but through feeling. The kind of knowing that bypasses logic and lands directly in the heart. She stood on the worn stones where the oracle once sat and closed her eyes. There was no one there, and yet the air pulsed with presence. It was as if time had folded inward, like she wasn't visiting the past, but walking back into it. Not to observe, to remember. Later, in the courtyard of a nearby guest house, Eliara met a man named Sage Naraya. He was soft-spoken, in his 40s, with silver threads in his dark curls and eyes that didn't just look at you, but through you. He wasn't a guru, and he didn't try to be. He simply shared what he knew, that the ancients didn't communicate with mere words. They used symbols, sound, geometry. They spoke in vibration. In the beginning, he said, the soul didn't need sentences. It understood truth through feeling, through image, through pattern. That's the original language, the one we've forgotten how to hear. She listened closely as he traced a spiral into the dirt with his fingertip, explaining how it appeared everywhere, from galaxies to fingerprints, from weather systems to sacred sites. The spiral is evolution, he said, not in a straight line, but a return, deeper each time. The next morning, he led a workshop on the vibrational nature of symbols, how sacred glyphs weren't static icons but living frequencies. Each one, when engaged with presence and intention, could unlock something dormant inside. Eliara sat in silence as he placed a series of hand-drawn symbols in front of the group. She didn't know their meanings, but as her eyes moved across them, her chest stirred. Her breath caught on one in particular, an interwoven star within a circle. She couldn't explain it, but looking at it felt like hearing a song she'd once known by heart. "You're not reacting to the shape," Naraya said quietly, standing behind her. "You're remembering the frequency, In the days that followed, Eliara painted constantly. Not for art, not for beauty, just to let the symbols come through. Spirals, circles, eyes, wings, stars. They flowed from her brush like they had been waiting for her hands. Each stroke felt like an incantation. Each color carried emotion she hadn't known how to speak. Sometimes, while painting, she would hum unintentionally, low, vowel-rich sounds that vibrated in her chest. She didn't know what the tones meant, but her body responded. Tears came, laughter, waves of peace. It wasn't performance, it was release. One evening, alone in her room, she lit a candle and whispered a sound she'd heard in a dream the night before. It wasn't a word in any language she recognized. It was more like a pulse, soft and sacred. Solare. As soon as she said it, something shifted. Her skin prickled, her chest opened, the air thickened, and in that moment, she felt what could only be described as presence move through the room. Not something outside of her, but something deep within her, returning. It was then she understood why mantras had endured across cultures and centuries. Not because of belief, but because of resonance. Sound is structure, vibration is memory, and some truths can only be remembered by being felt. On her last day in Delphi, Eliara walked the ancient path once taken by the pilgrims. It was narrow and winding, overlooking the valley below. She didn't think about where she was going. She let her body lead. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting the landscape in a golden glow, she stopped beside a small olive tree and rested her hand against its bark. She exhaled, slow and full, and whispered aloud, "I get it now." Not because she had figured something out, but because something had been activated. She was beginning to see the world differently, not as a place made up of things and names, but of frequencies, conversations between energies. And she understood now that symbols weren't just visual. They were living blueprints of consciousness, invitations, keys, and perhaps most importantly, she saw that she wasn't separate from them. She was one. Back in New York, weeks later, she turned her apartment wall into a canvas. Her symbols grew larger, more complex, more intuitive. People who visited her home would pause in front of the paintings, their breathing slowing, their voices softening. "I don't know why," one friend said, "but standing here, I feel like I remember something I can't name." Eliara smiled gently. "That's how you know it's real." She had stopped trying to explain herself. She had stopped needing others to validate her path. Because now, when she sat before a blank canvas, or traced a shape with her finger, or whispered a sound that made her skin buzz, she wasn't looking for understanding. She was honoring the language that never left her, the one the soul still speaks, and for the first time, she no longer feared forgetting, because she had remembered the way home. Not with logic, but with light. The hardest part wasn't the journey, it was returning from it. Eliara stepped off the plane and felt the full weight of New York press into her again. Its noise, its rhythm, its constant urgency. Everything moved fast. Conversations clipped, eyes glued to screens. The air buzzed with a kind of electricity that had nothing to do with energy and everything to do with distraction. And yet, she wasn't the same woman who had left. She had seen temples etched into stone. She had walked through silence and shadows. She had felt the sacred hum through her breath. But now, the question stood in front of her like a mirror. What does it mean to live what you've remembered? In the first few days back, she noticed something strange. The world hadn't changed, but her way of moving through it had. She didn't walk faster just because the sidewalk pulsed with urgency. She didn't reach for her phone the moment she sat down. She didn't rush to fill the quiet spaces with noise. Instead, she listened. Not with her ears, but with her presence. Even the smallest moments felt different now. Washing her hands became a ritual. Lighting a candle before bed became a ceremony. A simple meal, cooked with full attention, felt like a prayer. Not because of the act itself, but because of the awareness behind it. Eliara began to realize something profound, that spirituality wasn't some mountaintop state you reached and held on to. It was something you carried into the mess, into the mundane, into the moments most people overlooked. Enlightenment wasn't escape, it was embodiment. She found herself creating space in places she used to fill. She said no more often, not from defensiveness, but from clarity. She no longer felt the need to explain herself. She didn't need to wear the language of healing or decorate her life with symbols to prove she was evolving. Her peace no longer looked like silence. It looked like presence. There was a park near her apartment that she had passed hundreds of times. But one afternoon, she walked into it and sat under a tree without her phone, without a book, without a plan. She simply breathed. The breeze moved through the branches like a lullaby, and for the first time in a while, she felt herself smile. Not from joy, not from relief, but from alignment. This was it. The sacred wasn't in the distance. It was here. It was now. She didn't have to go somewhere far to access it. She had only to choose it, over and over again. One evening, she hosted a small breathwork circle in a rented room above a bookstore. There were no flyers, no ads, just a few friends, some candles, and a space of stillness. People came in carrying the heaviness of the world on their shoulders. And yet, as they breathed together, slow, deep, honest, something began to lift. Faces softened, tears came, laughter followed. Not because she had given them anything, but because she had reminded them how to return to what they already held. Afterward, one woman approached her with a trembling voice. "I didn't know peace could feel like this, without needing to fix anything." Eliara nodded. "That's because you remembered it. It was never gone." Kalen called a few nights later. His voice came through with warmth and a quiet steadiness she had come to recognize in herself. "I opened the sound studio," he said. "Small space, but it holds something real." They talked long into the night, not about theories or teachings, but about the ordinary beauty of bringing the sacred into the everyday. How presence was the real power. How simplicity was the highest form of mastery. They laughed about how they used to think awakening would feel like a constant high, when in truth, it often felt like grounding, like washing dishes slowly, like choosing to pause before speaking, like not needing to be anyone but yourself, fully and without apology. The following week, Eliara began teaching a weekly class on conscious living at a local community center. She didn't call it spiritual, she didn't label it at all, but people came. They came not for answers, but for stillness, for the safety of presence, for the memory of something real. She taught through questions more than instruction. What happens when you listen to your body? What changes when you eat with attention? What opens when you speak with honesty? "I don't know why," one friend said, "but standing here, I feel like I remember something I can't name." Eliara smiled gently. "That's how you know it's real." She had stopped trying to explain herself. She had stopped needing others to validate her path. Because now, when she sat before a blank canvas or traced a shape with her finger, or whispered a sound that made her skin buzz. She wasn't looking for understanding. She was honoring the language that never left her, the one the soul still speaks. And for the first time, she no longer feared forgetting, because she had remembered the way home, not with logic, but with light. The hardest part wasn't the journey. It was returning from it. Eliara stepped off the plane and felt the full weight of New York press into her again. Its noise, its rhythm, its constant urgency. Everything moved fast. Conversations clipped, eyes glued to screens. The air buzzed with a kind of electricity that had nothing to do with energy and everything to do with distraction. And yet, she wasn't the same woman who had left. She had seen temples etched into stone. She had walked through silence and shadows. She had felt the sacred hum through her breath. But now, the question stood in front of her like a mirror. What does it mean to live what you've remembered? In the first few days back, she noticed something strange. The world hadn't changed, but her way of moving through it had. She didn't walk faster, just because the sidewalk pulsed with urgency. She didn't reach for her phone the moment she sat down. She didn't rush to fill the quiet spaces with noise. Instead, she listened. Not with her ears, but with her presence. Even the smallest moments felt different now. Washing her hands became a ritual. Lighting a candle before bed became a ceremony. A simple meal, cooked with full attention, felt like a prayer. Not because of the act itself, but because of the awareness behind it. Eliara began to realize something profound, that spirituality wasn't some mountaintop state you reached and held on to. It was something you carried into the mess, into the mundane, into the moments most people overlooked. Enlightenment wasn't escape, it was embodiment. She found herself creating space in places she used to fill. She said no more often, not from defensiveness, but from clarity. She no longer felt the need to explain herself. She didn't need to wear the language of healing or decorate her life with symbols to prove she was evolving. Her peace no longer looked like silence. It looked like presence. There was a park near her apartment that she had passed hundreds of times. But one afternoon, she walked into it and sat under a tree without her phone, without a book, without a plan. She simply breathed. The breeze moved through the branches like a lullaby, and for the first time in a while, she felt herself smile, not from joy, not from relief, but from alignment. This was it. The sacred wasn't in the distance, it was here, it was now. She didn't have to go somewhere far to access it. She had only to choose it, over and over again. One evening, she hosted a small breathwork circle in a rented room above a bookstore. There were no flyers, no ads, just a few friends, some candles, and a space of stillness. People came in carrying the heaviness of the world on their shoulders. And yet, as they breathed together, slow, deep, honest, something began to lift. Faces softened, tears came, laughter followed. Not because she had given them anything, but because she had reminded them how to return to what they already held. Afterward, one woman approached her with a trembling voice. "I didn't know peace could feel like this, without needing to fix anything." Eliara nodded. "That's because you remembered it. It was never gone." Kalen called a few nights later. His voice came through with warmth and a quiet steadiness she had come to recognize in herself. "I opened the sound studio," he said. "Small space, but it holds something real." They talked long into the night, not about theories or teachings, but about the ordinary beauty of bringing the sacred into the everyday. How presence was the real power, how simplicity was the highest form of mastery. They laughed about how they used to think awakening would feel like a constant high, when in truth, it often felt like grounding, like washing dishes slowly, like choosing to pause before speaking, like not needing to be anyone but yourself, fully and without apology. The following week, Eliara began teaching a weekly class on conscious living at a local community center. She didn't call it spiritual. She didn't label it at all. But people came. They came not for answers, but for stillness, for the safety of presence, for the memory of something real. She taught through questions more than instruction. What happens when you listen to your body? What changes when you eat with attention? What opens when you speak with honesty? I've always felt different, he said. Like I didn't belong here. Like I came from somewhere else, but forgot why I came. Eliara smiled gently. You're not lost. You're waking up. He nodded slowly, as if those words had unlocked something he had been carrying for lifetimes. In that moment, she saw herself in him, not who she was now, but who she had been, the one with all the questions, the ache, the longing that had no name. And just like that, the circle continued. One awakens, and another begins. The next morning, Eliara climbed the tor alone. The path was muddy from the night's rain, the sky a mix of grey and gold. Each step felt like a prayer, each breath a continuation of something that had started long before this life. At the top, she stood facing the wind, arms loose by her sides, eyes closed. She wasn't asking for signs. She wasn't seeking guidance. She was simply being, rooted, software, alive. And in that stillness, a quiet truth rose in her chest like a whisper that came from the earth itself. You are not here to be saved. You are here to remember that you've always been sacred. She thought of every place she had visited, every shadow she had faced, every word she had spoken. It was all part of the same spiral, a return to self, a return to truth. She was not ascending anymore, she was integrating, walking the sacred down into the soil of her life, where it could root, grow, and become something others could touch. The temples of stone may stand silent, but the real temples were rising now, not from the earth, but from the hearts of those who remembered. People who chose presence over performance, truth over pretense, wholeness over perfection. People like her, people like you. And maybe that's why you're still here, still listening. Because something inside you knows that your journey isn't just about learning, it's about remembering. You were never meant to follow a path that didn't feel like home. You were meant to create one, step by step, breath by breath. Not to become more, but to become real, to live like the temple you already are, rising